Hey everybody, welcome to Bridging the Gap with Cheryl and
Roger.
we are back after a few weeks. It's been a while.
Yeah, we've been running, fam.
Yeah.
It's been crazy.
A lot of traveling, still traveling.
From a hotel room in Rochester, man, it is Siberia outside. We couldn't even go to church today. It's crazy.
Yeah. So we are back.
Y'all like my new shirt? I just got these. I ordered them. And they just showed up. I think they're pretty dope.
Yes. I lost my train of thought.
We've been gone for so long. We can't remember how to do videos. Train of thought.
What are we talking about? We're talking about why Black people are still struggling in America. This is the third part in our series, and our last video in the series, right?
Last video
in this
Black
series.
folks struggles in America.
Yes, and explaining why it's wrong or not factual to think that it's just because we're lazy or not as smart or not as savvy and all that stuff that we hear coming from people within our community and outside of our community. And so we're making sure everybody's on the same page about what actually happened historically in this country and why we are where we are.
And what's still happening.
Yes.
What's still happening.
What's still happening.
That whole narrative that we talked about last video with Martin saying, you know, it's pretty cruel to tell a bootless man to pull himself up by his bootstraps. We still hear that crap today. Why my ancestors came here as poor immigrants and, you know, we managed to overcome. Why can't you? Okay, we talked about some of the extreme things that were done from the end of slavery through Jim Crow and the civil rights era. Some of the extreme stuff that was done to prevent us from coming together and rising.
And having an equal playing field.
Yeah, just having an equal playing field, because when we have an equal playing field or anything close to it, when we fight, we win. They don't want us to win. So they've gone through some extreme measures in the past, but I want you to see it's not just that far removed from where we are right now. Some of the stuff is still going on today. So Jim Crow laws was about separate but equal, right? Let's examine how different that is today versus the early 1900s, late 1800s. All right.
So it started with what? Or what's still impacting us? Where are we starting?
We're going to start with education. Now, let me say this before we get into the education piece. The education system in America, really the education system globally, is not there to educate you, it's there to indoctrinate you. But the further you go in that system, the better chance you have of becoming a critical thinker, right? Having the ability to break down information, process information, and put information to use. The public school system is not for that. That's what higher education is for. College, master's degree, doctorate degree, that's where you learn critical thinking, if you're gonna learn it all, because you have some professors at that level who are tenured and will teach truth. Not many, but you have some. You will have those experiences on the college level. The high school level, junior high, elementary school level, it's 100% indoctrination, right? So let's take a look at the system of indoctrination, because it's not the system of education, and how that plays out between the races. Okay, so I'm going to read you guys a little bit from an article just talking about the public education and how that plays out between the Black community and white community. This article is from Hartford, Connecticut. Says, this is one of the wealthiest states in the Union, but thousands of children here attend schools that are among the worst in the country, while students in higher income towns such as Greenwich and Darien have easy access to guidance, counselors, school psychologists, personal laptops, and up-to-date textbooks. Those in high poverty areas like Bridgeport and New Britain don't. Such districts tend to have more students in need of extra help, and yet they have fewer guidance counselors, tutors, and psychologists, lower paid teachers, and more dilapidated facilities, and bigger class sizes than in wealthier districts. According to an ongoing lawsuit, Greenwich spends $6,000 more per pupil per year than Bridgeport does, according to the State Department of Education. That is $6,000 more for every single student every single year in the suburbs versus the inner city. That's really what we're looking at. Two different demographics.
How do we get there, though?
How do we get where?
You got two different demographics.
Yeah. Well, this is going to explain this. It says the discrepancies occur largely because public school districts in Connecticut and in most of America are run by local cities and towns and are funded by local property taxes. High poverty areas like Bridgeport and New Britain have lower home values and collect less taxes, and so they can't raise as much money as places like Darien or Greenwich, where homes are worth millions of dollars. Plaintiffs in a decade-old lawsuit in Connecticut, which heard closing arguments earlier this month, argue that the state should be required to ameliorate these discrepancies. So, in terms of education in this country, I saw a documentary that I've been talking about ever since I saw it. I was 26 years old. It was 1996. It was on HBO. And it was talking about how all over this country, we have this discrepancy in funding in inner city schools and suburban schools. The figure in this documentary said on average, it's about $4,000 for schools in the suburbs for every $1,000 spent on a child in the inner city. That is all over the country. So you have these different demographics, and the reason for that is property values fund schools, property taxes fund schools. So the inner cities is, you know, the less expensive place to live. Most times it's the hood, it's the ghetto, right? So if you don't have a home, or if you have a home and it's very low property values, the money that goes into the school system is a quarter of what they get 20, 30 miles outside the city. In this particular case, it's 1/6 of what they're getting in these higher end districts. That goes back to Jim Crow laws and separate but equal, right? Mm-hmm. Segregation. We live in different demographics. Our schools are funded based on the demographics and the wealth of those demographics, which means most of our children are in a place where their chances of success are slim to none, just because they don't have the resources available to them to give them the same education that they're getting in the suburbs. It's not rocket science, it's simple math. And
likely intentional, because if you get all the Black people into a certain area of the cities,
it's most definitely intentional.
You know, keep them all in this area.
That's what Jim Crow laws were for. Jim Crow laws were to keep us segregated so we wouldn't have access to the same things they have access to. And then when we realize that we can pull together the resources on our own and have our own access, they blew that stuff up. Black Wall Street. So you're not going to give us what you freely give to others. And again, this goes back to the whole redlining concept that we talked about in the last video, where they picked out Black communities and drew red lines around them, would not let bankers and insurance companies function in those regions where they functioned. That's where these demographics began. You separated them early on and separated out who could have access to resources and funding, and it creates this generational issue. So obviously, if a child is getting $4,000 to $6,000 more money poured into that child than that child's education every year than every child in the inner city, it's going to create a discrepancy in the ability to acquire knowledge. And knowledge is not power. applied knowledge is power, but you can't apply what you don't have,
Mhm.
right? So that's by design. That's not by accident. So let's take a look a little bit at the resources themselves, because we talked about redlining. I want you to see what Forbes has to say about our access to money now. So this is an article by Forbes. Let's see. Yeah, there it is. Forbes up top. This is what? May 7th, 2018. I'm not going to go too deep into this article. We're going to provide these links so you guys can read the whole article, but it's a lot of information. The title of the article says, Black home buyers denied mortgages more than twice as often as whites, the report finds. So again, the education that we get is determined by the demographics we live in and property values and property taxes that fund that education system. We are denied access to those funds more than twice as often as our white counterparts. How does that affect our education? I mean, 1 + 1 = 2 all day, every day, and twice on Sunday. That means that we don't have access to resources for education, which means our kids start behind the ball, behind the curve, behind the 8 ball. They don't have an equal shot at education out of the womb. From pre-K through K through 12, they don't get the same access to resources and information, which is kind of like what happened, with slavery. Okay, we're going to release you from slavery, but we're not going to give you the 40 acres and a mule. We're not going to give you the access to land and land grant colleges and training to farm those land. We're not going to give you those things. We're going to say it's equal, but we're not going to provide you things to make it equal.
We didn't need the training. We was already doing it.
We was already doing it, but the point is, the very things that were promised to us were actually given to somebody else, but you want to call it fair and equal, even when you want to call it equal but separate. There's no equal but separate. Our school system today proves that, and it's based on real estate. The real estate we're supposed to get, that 40 acres that we didn't get, would have played a role in that. The access to funding for real estate now plays a role in that to this very day. So we're going to take a look at the discrepancy, because we talked about that 40 acres and a mule and how much wealth that would have generated generationally in the Black community from slavery till now that we just didn't have access to. Now we want to take a look at the wealth gap and the differences between what we have now and what our white counterparts have now. This is a good article. You guys can read the whole thing, but I'm going to scroll down a little bit and just touch on some highlights here. I want to start with this. Right here, it says in 2016, the median wealth for Black and Hispanic families was this, respectively: $17,600 for Blacks, $20,700 for Hispanics, and in 2016, median wealth for white families was $171,000. It says exactly how bad is the wealth gap between Blacks and whites. According to 2016, this is a Federal Reserve data highlighted throughout this report. There are several key drivers perpetuating the considerable wealth gap between white and Black Americans. We're not going to read all this. We're going to touch on these bullet points. African Americans own approximately 1/10 of the wealth of white Americans. 1/10 of the wealth of white Americans. That's a problem, folks. How you call that equal? Even separate but equal there's no rationale for that. The Black-white wealth gap has not recovered from the Great Recession in 2007. Immediately before the Great Recession, the wealth gap was 14%. Now here we are a decade after the Great Recession, and we're now at 10%. of the wealth that our white counterparts hold. It says Black households have fewer and are in greater need of personal savings than their white counterparts. So we have less retirement and savings, but we have a greater need for savings and emergency funds, but we have less. African Americans face systemic challenges in narrowing the wealth gap with whites. The wealth gap persists regardless, now listen to this, the wealth gap persists regardless of household education. So if you manage to get into an institution of higher education and maybe get some graduate degrees and all those things, it doesn't matter your level of education. It doesn't matter your marital status. So take that whole, the breakdown of the Black families crap, take all that, throw it away. It doesn't matter your age or your income. It says, for instance, the median wealth for Black households with a college degree equaled about 70% of the median wealth for white households with a college degree. Even if we have the same level of education that you do have, we still only earn 70% of what you earn. Our wealth is 70% of what yours is. Part of that is systemic. It's that part of that is systemic. Part of that is just the lack of actually having wealth to deal with. That generational learning curve of dealing with wealth and passing it on to the next generation, something we just haven't really experienced. It says the gap worsened as households grow older. In 2016, Blacks between 50 and 65 years old and near retirement had about 10% of the wealth of whites in the same age group. This is down from the approximately 24% gap in 1998 when the same group of people were 32 to 47. So the older we get, the worse we do, the less we have. That is part of that knowledge transfer of dealing with money, establishing a financial legacy, leaving something to the next generation. We haven't been dealt that. I said in one of the previous videos, I saw a statistic that said the baby boomer generation of Black people in this country will be the first generation of Blacks in this country to leave their heirs worse off than they were when they started. A lot of that has to do with the knowledge of what to do with money, how to create a legacy and generational wealth. We were robbed of those things. So as we get older, we do worse, not better, which is crazy.
And this is kind of off topic and we didn't talk about it, but maybe we ought to do a video where you can help shed some knowledge about that stuff, since that's what you do.
Financially?
Yeah.
We can do that.
For our subscribers.
We got to understand that the education system is tied directly into our mindsets and how we function, and it's that way by design. And Rockefeller and Carnegie, to this day, are still controlling the education system and ultimately controlling this for the masses of us. But you got to see, in the early 1900s, they knew exactly what they were doing. They told us what they were doing. So yeah, we'll do a video to try to deal with the mindset of money. And deal with the mindset of slavery, because everything they do is about slavery. It doesn't matter if it's the actual bondage of putting yokes around your neck, or whether it's the tax system, or whether it's the school system, or whether it's the W-2 system. All of them are a form of slavery, every last one of them. So that's a whole nother topic, but we will definitely touch on that at some point in time. It says African Americans have fewer assets than whites and are less likely to be homeowners, to own their own businesses, and to have a retirement account. So let's talk about assets, because we're talking about money. Here's one thing that I know about wealthy people. They don't rely on a paper currency of any country. They rely on assets, hard assets, tangible assets. We have an addiction to a dollar, and that dollar is dying. And wealthy people understand assets, what it's about. One of the biggest asset forms is real estate. And as we talked about earlier, the education system that we have is based upon the property taxes that are received off of real estate. That is why elite families live in the areas that they live in, because they know their kids are going to get the best education out there. And it's all about real estate, assets. We'll cover that in this other video that Cheryl was mentioning. We'll talk about that as well. Then it goes on to say Black households have more costly debt. In 2016, Blacks with debt typically owe $35,560, which is 40% less than their white counterparts. $93,000 is what they had in debt. Then he goes on to say, however, because blacks owed larger amounts of high interest debt, such as installment credit, student loans, car loans, the debt they typically owed was more expensive. For example, blacks carry larger credit card balances than whites. That goes back to this whole access to resources thing and how that's divvied up. Remember, we talked about redlining, and we talked about the predatory lending practices and financial crisis. And being in the mortgage business, how mortgage officers were targeting black families with A paper credit and putting them in C paper loans. That means higher interest rates. We are absolutely targeted by the bankers to pay more, even when we have less debt. So somebody tell me where all this is fair and balanced and equal. All right, so this is the everyday life of black folks in America. It starts with what you know. And what you know, what goes in here, and how you progress in your thoughts is dictated primarily by the assets that you own and the property taxes from those assets. And the demographics of where you live determine all of that. So by the population centers, the inner cities being where most black folks live, inherently your children don't get the same education as they do in the suburbs. And there's nothing you can do about that because you can't change the property values of everywhere around. You can fix your house up. That's not going to change the property values in your area.
And talk about mindset, even if you get out of the inner city and go to the suburbs with the same mindset and your children are in suburban schools, your kids struggle still.
Absolutely.
So,
because it's a generational thing. We have not experienced, having that mindset of actually getting a good education, what to do with that education. Even when we earn with the money, as we saw in that last illustration, the older we get, we don't know what to do with it. It's been generations of not having any education and being indoctrinated by the system to give back everything you've earned. The elite in this country, the 1% in this country, are about building wealth generationally. And that's a biblical principle. The Bible says a wise man will leave an inheritance for his children's children. How many black folks do you know that operate under that principle? Right? But we've been talking about the average everyday person, where you go to school, where you get your children educated, the assets that you own, the property tax that you pay that funds their schooling. That's everyday folks. But it doesn't matter if it's everyday folks or if you're Byron Allen or Bill Cosby or anybody on that level of being in hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars. They're still not going to treat you equally. So this case with Byron Allen that the Supreme Court just heard about a week and a half ago, he was basically suing Comcast and Charter, I believe it is, for not working with black-owned media. Basically saying we're going to carve you out of the advertising dollars because we don't want to work with you. And so Byron Allen's case was that you're being discriminatory. Comcast and Charter took the position that for you to say I'm discriminating against you means you have to prove that everything is about your skin color. And I think that's the but-for clause that they mentioned, that every single part of the reason I don't want to work with you is about your skin color. Okay, well that takes us back to the first civil rights law that was put on the books in 1866, became a central premise in this case, which the Justice Department, the United States Justice Department, actually did an amicus brief for Comcast. And of the 30 minutes that Comcast had to argue in front of the Supreme Court, they gave 10 minutes to Bill Barr's Justice Department to argue on their behalf as they attack the 1866 law on civil rights. It was the first, it wasn't the Civil Rights Act, but it was the first legislation about civil rights. Once the Civil War was over and slavery came to an end, they knew. The point is, they knew immediately. 1865, slavery came to an end. 1866, they knew they had to enact laws because there was not a level playing field. But this is still being argued today by the justice system. And what I want to do is I want to read this 1866 piece of legislation to you and look at how it's progressed, ending up in the courts today where they're trying to abolish the very first law. We haven't heard from the Supreme Court. They've heard the arguments, but they haven't given a decision yet. But it doesn't matter where you're at on the economic spectrum, the social spectrum, the educational or intelligence spectrum. You are not going to be included. And it's been shown over time through slavery, Jim Crow, civil rights era to this very day. They don't want to give us a fair playing field. That's just the fact. So let's read this law and then examine a little bit about how this has progressed over time.
And I think they know with the level playing field,
It's over.
where we would be.
Look at what they did to Black Wall Street. You wanted us segregated, and now you're mad that you pushed us out and we don't want you a part of what we're doing. So you blow it up. That's insane. In Red Summer, all across the whole country, when we fight, we win. When we come together, we unite, we rise. And they've shown that they're willing to go to extremes. So when you read stuff like this, it's not hard to conceive that all of this is intentional. So here's what this law says. It says, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power, excluding Indians not taxed, are hereby to be citizens of the United States, and such citizens of every race, color, without regard to any previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude. I'm gonna pause right here and point out the fact that they excluded Indians not taxed. We're gonna talk about that later, but so what this is saying is Indians are not they're not citizens of the United States based on this law. Okay. Is race, color, without
Except
regard.
as punishment.
Okay, so involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall have the same right in every state and territory in the United States to make and enforce contracts. As we talk about the financial piece, I think we're going to have to talk a little bit about contracts because they tell you what's important to them. So there'll be enforced contracts to sue, to be parties, and to give evidence. So basically, they'll be able to sue white people in a court of law, be a party to a lawsuit, and give evidence in that lawsuit. They'll be able to inherit, to purchase, to lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property, and to full and equal benefit of all the laws, proceedings for the security of persons and property, as is enjoyed by white citizens. Then it goes on to say, and shall be subject to like punishments, pains, and penalties, and to none other any law, state, statute, ordinance, regulation, or custom to the contrary notwithstanding. Okay, so this is a law that says now we can actually engage in contracts. And what that ultimately meant was business contracts. That's what that was focused on. We can engage in business contracts. We can actually take part in proceedings, legal proceedings. We can sue people. We can present evidence. Presumably, we could be on a jury, which didn't happen. And that we'll be able to buy and sell property and all of those things just like our white counterparts, and that our punishments for doing things that we shouldn't be doing will be equal to the white counterparts. It just clicked in my mind. We should have pulled this up, but I'm gonna say it now. If you just look at the punishment aspect, it is clear as day for the exact same crimes, we get far more time. Under the exact same circumstances, you take young people, make stupid mistakes in life, have never had any kind of criminal record, if they're black or white, determines how much time they spend behind bars.
Or whether they get charged as an adult or as a juvenile.
All kinds of different, lines of demarcation as to what's fair and what's not are applied differently, whether you're black or white. So we don't get the same punishments. So let's take a quick look and see, are we able to carry out some of the things that they said? The law, they said we can now inherit lands and purchase lands, and well, we just covered that. We have the redlining that was evident This is far after 1866 when that redlining was taking place. And today, as of last year, we got an article from Forbes that says we're denied loans twice as much as white folks. And this wealth gap still exists. Okay, well, this was the first law put on the books. So they knew that it wasn't going to be a fair playing field, and they knew they need to do something to try to stimulate a fair playing field. How did it actually play out? We're going to look at another document here that's going to show us kind of the progression of the things that they tried to pull off here in 1866. Okay. I have this where I want to start, but I want to see where. So this is Wikipedia breaking down the history. I'm just going to start here, right under history. It says, following the American Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution and the abolishment of slavery guaranteed basic civil rights to African Americans. And then there was a Civil Rights Act. So in 1865, slavery goes away, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment to the Constitution. In 1875 was the first Civil Rights Act, and it extended this to public accommodation and jury selection, including the establishment of criminal penalties for court officers who interfered. So it wasn't until 1865 where they specifically addressed it and said, we have the ability to sit on a jury too, not just to be able to bring lawsuits and present evidence, because if we can't be a part of the jury, there's no way we're being treated fairly, where we can be judged by others, but we can't sit in judgment of others. So it was addressed in this 1875 Civil Rights Act, the first act. Then in 1880, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Strouder versus West Virginia that laws excluding Black people from jury service violated the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment. So in 1866, they made it clear that we should be able to engage in everything, right? But then in 1875, they had to actually pass a Civil Rights Act that said specifically that we have to be able to be on the jury, and anybody interfering with that can be punished if they interfere. Here we are 5 years after that, the Supreme Court is stating that laws excluding, so even though these laws and these civil rights laws and acts are on the book, there are still laws that are excluding Black people from jury service, and the court's having to address that, right? So then in 1883, which is just 3 years later, in 1883, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was overturned entirely by the Supreme Court in an 8-1 decision. In 1896, the landmark case Plessy versus Ferguson enshrined the unofficial civil code termed Jim Crow. So in 1866, they knew that there was something that needed to be done if this was ever going to be fair and viable. In 1865, they actually passed a Civil Rights Act that addressed us being able to sit on a jury, not just bring evidence and all that other stuff. In 1880, the Supreme Court had to speak to it. In 1883, they reversed it, wiped it out. In 1896, they passed Jim Crow, separate but equal. So obviously, it was known from the beginning when slavery was ended that if this thing is going to be fair, it's going to have to be laws around it to make it fair. None of those laws were carried out.
Make it look like it's fair on paper.
Well, they made it, no, I said to make it fair, there's going to have to be laws, but those laws have to be carried out
by people
for it to actually be fair. Instead of carrying out those laws, they overturned it in 1883, and 13 years later, they issued in by Supreme Court, Plessy versus Ferguson, Supreme Court decision saying that Jim Crow's okay, separate but equal. That's what we're dealing with today. That's what our children deal with today in terms of the schooling that they get. Hold on, let me scroll down just a little bit. That's what they get today. That's what we get when we go to get funding for a business or a mortgage. This is what we get today, which is no different than the redlining of the past. Nothing has really changed since the 1800s. So in 1896 was Plessy versus Ferguson. Then in 1931, there was the Scottsboro Boys case. But ultimately in 1935 down here, it says the appeals courts in the case ultimately led to landmark Supreme Court decisions. Landmark decisions in Powell versus Alabama in 1935, the court ruled that the criminal defendants are entitled to effective counsel. So we didn't have that before. And then bigger than that, Norris versus Alabama, that blacks may not be excluded systemically from jury service. This is 1935. Slavery ended in 1865. The first law on the books was 1866. Here we are 70 years later and the court's still dealing with this issue. It was mentioned in the first, in the Civil Rights Law of 1866 that we should be able to engage in the judicial process. That we should be able to bring suits and present evidence. And now we're repeatedly hearing the Supreme Court say, guys, you can't exclude them from the jury box. Here we are 70 years later still dealing with that. Was that the end of it? No. Despite Norris, the practice of excluding black people from juries did not disappear. In 1985, the Supreme Court in Batson versus Kentucky addressed a situation where a prosecutor had used his peremptory challenge to strike all 4 black candidates from a jury and obtained a conviction against a black defendant. I'm gonna go on. The defendant was not able to demonstrate that the court system systemically excluded black people from juries, but nonetheless raised due process and equal protection arguments in this particular case. In Batson, the court ruled that the defendant could make a prima facie case for purposeful racial discrimination in jury selection. This is 1985, folks. I was 15 years old. This is our lifetime. It's been 120 years since the end of slavery and the first implementation, you can go ahead and put it back on full screen there, and the first implementation of some sort of civil rights law. 120 years later, we still got prosecutors eliminating people on skin color alone and putting people in jail behind that. And the court determining that it was racial prejudice behind it. How do we have all of these different prejudices in education, these different prejudices in resources and funding, and in different prejudices when it comes to our freedom and whether we are free or not? 120 years later, but people are talking about pull yourself up by your bootstraps and everything's equal and fair in America. This is our lifetime. This is what's going on right here, right now, to the point where Byron Allen is just trying to get a monster company like Comcast to let them into a $70 billion industry and be fair about it. It doesn't matter who you are. If your skin looks like this, if you are a melanated individual in this country, you're not going to really get a fair playing field. It's just, they've proven that.
Not going to happen.
Like Cheryl asked me in one of the previous videos, can we accomplish that here? I don't know. But I believe if we ever accomplish it here, it's going to be through means that I'm not willing to go through. There's going to be a lot of bloodshed. You don't give up authority and power by choice. You give it up by force. And the writing is on the wall for me that there's nothing changed. You have the Justice Department of the United States of America trying to argue down the very first civil rights law ever put on the books. If that don't tell us something, I don't know what will. I don't think it's ever been done. I don't think the Justice Department has ever argued in the Supreme Court on behalf of a company. But the fact that they're doing that is crazy enough in and of itself, but what they're arguing and the amicus brief that they put together with this but-for standard, you have to prove that every bit of what I'm discriminating against you is about your skin color. Nobody can prove that 100%. Nobody can prove that. So they're taking away the ability to bring legislation against these giants, and the Justice Department is assisting them in doing that. Don't know what the court's final outcome is going to be, or what they're going to say about it, but the fact that it's even being argued, that standard is being argued and argued by the United States Department of Justice is troubling beyond belief.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But this is the state of affairs. This is where we are in America.
Free but not free. Free but not equal. Not even free.
Yeah, I'm struggling with the whole free thing. We're just not.
There are people, we didn't talk about this, but like the video we saw the other day, which was like one of the latest, the guy going in the building. He wasn't black, but he was, I think he was Latino. He was going to visit his aunt, and there's this white lady who's being the, building police.
Hallway Holly.
Yeah, Hallway Holly. Like questioning him about why he's there. Let me see your ID. Who are you going to visit? Like, who are you? But that's how they feel. And I think even more so today with the current climate and the current administration, they're getting bolder, and we to them are not free to just go wherever. There was another video the other day about a guy, these workers in a truck, and a white guy came up to them. Did you see that one? Questioning them about why they were there. They were there working, but here they had to explain themselves to this white guy who they automatically think that they have some authority to question you if they don't think you belong there. Next thing is going to be where your papers at. Because basically that's kind of like what it is. Like, you don't belong in this neighborhood. Who are you? Let me see your ID. Who are you here to see?
Nazi Germany, which wasn't what you thought it was either, by the way. But we're going to get into all of this. The question is, why is this what it is from the beginning? From Cape Coast, Elmina Castle, to now. Why is it what it is?
Before that.
Well, even before that, but that when slavery started, because this is still indentured servitude to some degree. When I can't go see my family members in their place of residence without some white woman checking me and asking me for my ID, I ain't no citizen. I'm not free in this country. And nothing happens to these people. They make these calls to the police, wasting taxpayer dollars over foolishness, and nothing happens to them. So
that guy was there with his two little kids. She said that there's been a lot of robberies or thievery lately. So this guy's there to rob the building with his two little kids.
Two elementary school children is going to commit a robbery with?
Yeah. Maybe he's going to put them through the mail slot or something. I don't know.
Go in there, unlock the door. But here's the point that was made in one of the comments on this post. If these people were really fearful, you would not be blocking this man's standing in his way, calling the police, talking crazy about him, dead in his face, impeding his progress. You're not going to do that if you're afraid.
No, it's a power play.
It's an absolute power play. You have no fear, because I promise you, there's brothers out here you should be afraid of doing that. Mm-hmm. Let me just put it like, don't step in front of me like that, because I don't know you and I don't owe you anything, and I refuse to let you treat me less than. That's not going to happen. She would have been moved one way or the other. She'd have chose to move or she'd have got moved, but I'm going to go where I was intending to go, and you are not going to stop me, because you don't have that power. You don't have that authority, regardless of what you think or what your president might make you think. You don't have that. These people are going to learn something one day, one way. But the fact that you're standing there doing this, treating this man like this, so you're not afraid. You are not worried about what he might be there to do. You're there to impose your authority on him and his kids, and it's unacceptable. 100% unacceptable. But going back to what I was just asking, the question of why. Why is this what it is, and where did it start? Because now we're going to get into we've done the history. I think we're all on the same page of what this has looked like for the past several hundred years. We want to go back to why it even started. We had to cover the history first, but our next video, we're going to start jumping into the things that are going to be some tender spots for all of us, because we've been lied to. We've been lied to about so many things. From our education system, to our food, to our money, to our taxes, to who we are and what this whole racial issue is about. We have been lied to. So this is where this conversation gets difficult. starting in the next video. Well, probably not the next video because we have several videos we haven't had time to do that we're going to do.
Yeah.
But our next real content video is where this conversation is going to get difficult. So I want to end this one and start that one with this one principle. We have a biblical worldview, and there was nothing that can change that. The Lord, our Savior, the Messiah, came here for anybody and everybody who wants to be in relationship with the Father. So none of what we're going to share has any, like I said, I've said it several times, this color thing is a man-made issue. It does not mean anything to God. If you can take your kidney out of a white person, put it in a brother and save his life, or a heart or a liver or whatever, clearly God designed it that way. So the color issue that we see and the challenges that we deal with on this planet are man-made. We're just exposing them for what they are. We don't ascribe to that. I don't do racism either way. Won't have it, can't stand it.
Well, it can only go one way.
I disagree.
I know.
We don't, she militant. I told y'all that.
No.
We don't agree on a lot of stuff.
You could be prejudiced the other way.
You can be racist too.
No, you can't.
Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Anyway, having said that, I don't do it either way. I don't play it. I can't stand it. So as we get into these tough issues and reveal some of the lies that have been told, it's going to rub some people. Understand. Truth will do that sometimes. But it's not a hateful truth. It is simply the truth. It's history. Because like the history we've just laid out with the redlining and the history of Black Wall Street and what's going on today in the banking system and how our schools are so underfunded, and it's designed by demographics to be just, they know that the schools are going to be underfunded. It's all systemic. This is what systemic racism is. Without talking about those things, you may not know that those things took place. Red Summer. How many of you know about that? Just because you saw the movie Rosewood doesn't mean you knew that happened all over the country in 25 different cities in just one summer.
Not only that, we were talking earlier about how, what was the survey that most Americans don't even know the 3 branches of government? So
75% right now.
Yeah.
Right now in America, 75% of US citizens can't name the 3 branches of government. And only 1/3 of those polled could name 1 branch of government.
Right. So if we as Americans don't know that, we know even less about the real history of this country.
Not only this country, but before this country ever
Yes.
even existed.
Yes.
You don't know the history.
No.
So what we're about to share with you is just an extension of the history we've already given, because we have to put that in context, because this is where we're at. We're in America. Now we're going to really shape your mindset so you can see why it is what it is from the beginning, because it's all history. And it's been told by the people who are telling the lies. So like I said, think about it.
Ain't nothing new under the sun.
Nothing new under the sun.
Just a different time.
If they've lied to you about your food, they've lied to you about education, they've lied to you about your money, I promise you they've lied to you about the tax system. If they're teaching it on a mass scale, it's not the truth, because they control the narrative. And as I'm saying that, we probably need to even do the clip that you were explaining about the education system. We probably need to do that before we even get into the rest of this history, so you can understand the links that they went to and the mindset of those who started our education system. They had it in their mind to control the masses from day one. Before they even started, there was a mission in place. So maybe I got to find some time to finish these other videos. There's about 3 of them we need to get out to y'all, but I need to squeeze that one in prior to doing the rest of the history, because it's important. You got to understand that these people are not telling you the truth about anything.
Anything.
And that's another biblical principle. The Bible says, wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to what? Destruction. Narrow is the gate and thin is the road that leads to salvation, and there are few who will find it. Anything they're teaching the masses to do is not right. It's not for us, it's for them. So I think that's about all we can squeeze into this one video. I'm gonna do a presentation for you guys on what's called the General Education Board and Friends. And we're gonna look at how our Board of Education came to be and how the government realized how bad they messed up. So with that, I hope you guys all had a good Turkey Day. Spent some time with family and ate too much of the holidays that we tend to celebrate. That is one we do still celebrate because it's a legitimate non-pagan.
That's family day.
Call it what you will. My wife militant, y'all. She militant.
That's the day I get to see my family because we all come together. That's the only time of year we all come together.
Well, I'm gonna say this: as far as we're concerned, that's a non-pagan holiday. It is. I'm gonna get into that too. I'm gonna explain to y'all why it's a non-pagan holiday. I'm gonna explain to y'all how Google is lying to us now. I just realized this yesterday. I looked up something that I looked up that nobody knows because they don't. Why don't
you just tell them that part?
Oh Lord Jesus, but really?
Yes, because we're just past Thanksgiving. Just tell them that part real quick.
Okay, a little history for you. George Washington was not the first president of this country. George Washington was the 8th president of this country. The very first president of the United States of America was a black man named John Hanson. If you know who John Hanson is, you can look him up. He was the one who instituted Thanksgiving. I researched that information about a year ago or maybe less to share with my wife, who's swatting my hand away because I'm thinking, to share with her who John Hanson was and that Thanksgiving was not one of these pagan holidays. There was a reason behind that. What happened is John Hanson didn't have the funding to pay the troops, and they almost lost the Union, and pretty much all of Congress bailed on him. And he managed to keep it together, managed to get the troops paid, settled everything down, and he instituted the holiday of Thanksgiving. Just glad that they were able to maintain and keep things together in this country, right? He was the first president. George Washington was the 8th. George Washington was the first president of the corporate United States. There are 2 constitutions in this country, the Organic Constitution and the Corporate Constitution. George Washington was the first of the 2nd Constitution, simply because they could not do what they're doing today under the Organic Constitution. They had to create a territory to carve out for them to operate. If you think about it, Washington, D.C. is not a state, it's a territory. It is not part of the United States. And that's because of that. And this secondary constitution allowed them to do what they do. But when you're looking back at history, and I tell you that they lie to us about everything, they want you to believe Barack Obama was the first black president of this country. He was not the first black president. The first president was the first black president. And he was the one who instituted Thanksgiving. Now, just the other day, maybe yesterday, I was Googling that same information that I Googled about a year ago to show Cheryl. And it pulled up the first thing that gave us some little blurb on Abraham Lincoln as being the one to institute it. And then further down the page, matter of fact, I Googled it a second time and talked about the Pilgrims and the Indians and some other nonsense. And I was like, Google has hidden the truth. I Googled that same information a year ago and it pulled up John Hanson as be the one who instituted Thanksgiving as a holiday in this country. You pull it up now, it talks about the Pilgrims, talks about the Indians, or it talks about Abraham Lincoln. But if you Google John Hanson and Thanksgiving, then you can pull it up.
But you got to know about John Hanson in order to find the information.
Just 1 year ago, you didn't have to know who he was. You did not have to know that he was a president in this country. You didn't have to know anything. All you had to do was Google the beginning of Thanksgiving, and it told you the truth a year ago. Google is now suppressing the truth, which is kind of what they do. This has been their pattern. This has been their history from Jump Street. And I think too many people are waking up to the truth. Now they're going to extremes once again to prevent you from knowing the truth. Look them up. Google, how did Thanksgiving start? Then Google John Hanson and Thanksgiving. It's two different stories on the same search engine. With that, we hope that you guys enjoyed your Thanksgiving. To me, it's not a pagan holiday. It was instituted by a great man in this country's history who's been forgotten. And it's about family and friends and enjoying and loving on one another and spending time together. So I'm going to let my wife call it Family Day with her militant self. Whatever day you want to call it, we hope you enjoyed it. Hope you spent some time with family and have some good food. And we hope you guys enjoy this ride that we're about to go on because it's about to get deep.
All righty, we're done.
Yeah, with that, we'll wrap this one up. Sorry, that one's a little bit longer than most, but it's time to turn the corner and to get into some real truth. And we had to cover the nonsense that we've been told for the last couple hundred years to get into the truth of why that is going down the way it's going down, because there's a reason for it. All right, folks, we will talk to you soon. God bless.
Okay, bye-bye.